When you hear the word revolution, you probably immediately think violence. You may think of the French Revolution, a bloody revolt against the French monarchy which saw major foreign conflicts and a reign of terror that saw thousands killed in a glut of violence. You may think of the Russian Revolution, a whirlwind of violence that saw multiple uprisings against governments, countless massacres, and a 6-year civil war. What you might not think of is art. In many cases, the forerunner of a general popular or social revolution is a revolt of the arts. In a society of potentially stifling and rigid cultural standards, a quick way to set yourself apart and live free of imposed standards is to create. Artistic self-expression, in many ways, is the ultimate form of personal revolt, short of just standing up and fucking shooting people. Art, in all its forms, captures the mind. It captures the public consciousness in a way few other things can. With creation comes influence, and with influence comes power. When one person breaks artistic norms, they are considered strange, outliers, nonconformists who hate stable society, and a million other demeaning things. When many people break these norms and declare their dissatisfaction with the state of a society, they become a type of revolutionary. On August 9th of 1948, Le Refus Global was published in Montreal by a group of Quebecois artists of all disciplines calling themselves Les Autonomistes. They were quite the collection, 8 men and 7 women who were heavily involved in avant-garde art movements like Surrealism. The manifesto was nothing short of scandalous. It presented a simple argument. Quebec was drowning. Its culture and artistic expression were being smothered by a political correctness imposed by the all-powerful Catholic Church and deeply conservative societal interests, which included the political party that formed the provincial government essentially unopposed. This extreme conservatism, something that served to defend Quebecois culture against Anglo-Protestant assimilation in the past, was now becoming the very thing that would destroy it socially, politically, and economically. It essentially called for the total liberation of the arts, of free thought and self-expression, and liberation from the norms and standards imposed upon Quebecois society. In effect, it called for a revolution of consciousness. The manifesto criticized the citizens of Quebec for serving as pawns in this machine, and criticized the political and economic interests that had infected art and driven it towards its own self-destruction. The manifesto was critical of just fucking everybody, with many of its attacks implied to be directed towards one man in particular. The man who could very easily be seen as the individual behind the continued smothering of Quebec and her culture due to his borderline authoritarian stranglehold on the politics of the province. Maurice Duplessis. I've heard it pronounced Duplessis. We're just gonna run with Duplessis for this one. While the manifesto called for a social revolution, it would need to wait. Duplessis' rule was simply too airtight, his pockets too deep. For revolution to sweep Quebec, he would need to die. And unfortunately for our would-be visionaries, they were about a decade too early. He wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, something that would have devastating consequences for the signatories of the manifesto. Many of them were raked over the coals in the media, the leader of the group lost his job, and the rest were largely forced to disperse, many leaving the province entirely. Happy Canada Day, hosers. It's time for your mandatory viewing of Canadian content. Don't forget to save the drunken debauchery for later. Right now, you will be edumacated and you will like it. So, let's turn back the clock a bit. How the fuck did we get here? Well, as with many things, we must look to the eternal Anglo. In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, the English suddenly ruled over a whole lot of French people. The trillion Reichsmark question, how do you deal with them? With the Acadians, the answer was pretty simple. Ethnic cleansing, but for the Quebecois it was more complicated since there were actually a lot of people there and it would be very hard to get rid of them. So the Brits elected to adopt the policy of letting them do their own thing and gradually assimilate the French population over time. The Quebec Act of 1774 guaranteed certain liberties for the French population, including the usage of the French language in government and an extreme amount of leeway for the Catholic Church, which was allowed to retain control over education and most social services. However, successive English governments pushed policies that gradually attempted to strip back some of this autonomy, and very slowly the French Canadians began to be outnumbered and outvoted by the English. This combined with several rebellions, economic and agricultural downturn, mass emigration, and a whole lot of political bullshit surrounding Confederation to create a French-Canadian culture that was fighting for its very survival in many instances. Much deference was given to the Catholic Church, as Catholicism was seen as something decidedly not English that a French-Canadian identity could rally around. As such, Quebecois society became deeply conservative conservative and traditional as a way of defending itself against erasure by the English majority. It is in this environment that on April 20th of 1890 in the village of Yamashish, near the city of Trois-Rivières, I'll give you 3 guesses as to what natural feature gives the city its name, Maurice Lenoble Duplessis was born. He was the second child and only son of 5. His father was a man named Neri Lenoble Duplessis, a farm boy turned lawyer who was an aide of the bishop in the region, who was an ultramontanist. Ultramontanism is basically just a very radical Catholic social doctrine that emphasizes the supremacy of the church over the state. He used this connection to be elected member of the Legislative Assembly for the region as a conservative. Maurice's mother, Marie Catherine Camille Bertha Genest, was actually of Ulster Scottish descent and also a Protestant, making Maurice very uniquely culturally aware of both the Anglo-Protestant and French Catholic populations of the province. Maurice was born into veritable fucking luxury, upper middle class at the least and very well off for the time. The family was very influential in the social circles of the upper class as well as in the church, since Neri was, in bed with the fucking bishop. As such, Maurice's childhood was so unbelievably uneventful that you can probably copy-paste your own here if you really wanted to relate to the character. He did child things, but with more religion. His upbringing did give him an appreciation for art and literature, since he did have time to explore these things, and his borderline aristocratic father instilled a deep gentlemanliness in the man. In 1898, at the age of 8, he would attend the Collège Notre Dame in Montreal, an all-boys school run by a Catholic order. He did very well and was very well liked by his classmates and teachers, but oftentimes was an absolute dipshit who got himself into trouble by pissing around. In 1900, the Conservatives were crushed in Quebec, causing Neri to lose his seat, but 4 years later he would be elected mayor of Trois-Rivières. On many of these campaigns, Maurice would tag along with his father, becoming entranced by the political life, absorbing all sorts of political statistical bullshit that bores me to sleep. There's a reason I didn't take poli-sci, and he even gave his first public speech at the age of 10. In 1902, Maurice would attend the Trois-Rivières Seminary, where he further showcased himself to be a brilliant student as well as a talented speaker and debater. The only thing he struggled with was sports. He never practiced one, save for, of all things, croquet. He was every pretentious jackass that you wanted to dropkick. He spent his free time away from being a pretentious high schooler by instead being a pretentious career politician. He was involved in political organizations of all stripes as a volunteer for most of his teenage years. However, you still kind of needed to be somebody to really get your foot in the door, so in 1910 he began attending law school at Laval University. Now, if there's any prospective law students in the audience, I'm gonna give you some life advice. If your parents aren't lawyers, you will need to work 5 times as hard to get the same results as a nepo baby. Duplessis absolutely did the work, and he was a very smart cookie, but he was immediately given job and internship opportunities because his dad was a lawyer and he knew people in the field. Otherwise, his university experience was about as university as it gets. He drank like a fish and he fucked. Pretty simple. And much to the chagrin of his more traditionally religious and modest father, Maurice walked and talked like he fucked. He was a mythical socializer who was willing to flaunt his money and influence, something that would come to greatly impact his life. In 1913, he would pass the bar exams and enter into law practice as a full-fledged lawyer, opening his own practice with a few university friends. He focused heavily on the lower and middle working classes, as he could use his intelligence and oratorical skills to win very consistently. As such, he built a reputation as a popular and trustworthy lawyer who would stand up for the little guy. During the runtime of the First World War, he also began dating a woman named Augustine Delisle. She was from a working class background, which Maurice's family didn't like, and they forced him to not marry her. This permanently wrecked his relationship with much of his extended family, and perhaps out of sheer spite, meant he would never in his life marry. I can respect a man for falling so hard for a girl that he straight up breaks tradition and decides to end the bloodline with him. Kinda base, to be honest. But let's be real, you saw the title and thumbnail, you weren't here for Duplessis being a hotshot lawyer, you're here for the political bullshit. After the World War ended, the political bullshit would arrive in force. Being a lawyer was always kinda meant to just be a stepping stone to a political career. Despite the conservative nature of Quebec society, the conservative parties got absolutely slaughtered both provincially and federally. This was largely because provincial conservatives tended to be pro-federalism, while the liberals were more autonomist. The last time in Quebec history that the Conservative Party would form government was 1892, and the 1897 election saw unchallenged liberal dominance until the late 1930s. In this environment, Duplessis was seen by many as a man who could revitalize stabilize the Conservative cause and prevent them from getting slaughtered by the Liberals for another century, which seemed on track to happen at the rate things were going. Duplessis did some campaigning for the Conservatives, both provincially and federally, in the early 1920s. His first campaign management role was serving Louis-Philippe Normand in 1921, and in 1923 he himself ran for MLA for Trois-Rivières against Louis-Philippe Mercier. The Liberals knew Duplessis would be a problem, so even the Premier himself, Louis-Alexandre Taschereau, showed up to personally aid Mercier's campaign. He campaigned as an underdog, a working-class man fighting the big politicians with their machines and bottomless finances. He had no intention of winning, he just wanted to make a good showing, and by exploiting his popularity amongst the common folk, his fellow lawyers, and his dad's connections, he performed admirably, losing by about 300 votes. The cons got smashed in this election too, but down in Montreal, it did serve to jumpstart the career of Camillien Houde, future mayor of Montreal and big shot conservative. Later in the year, he continued campaigning in by-elections and going on speaking tours in the countryside, and he actually succeeded in flipping 2 seats against the government. He worked in the shadows, building his skill until 1927, when the next round of provincial elections came about. He went in for a rematch with Mercier. This time, Duplessis was far more prepared and more experienced. He spent every waking moment walking around the riding, knocking on doors, recalling people's faces and names, and making himself look like an approachable people's champion. He followed Mercier around and spoke at the same crowds just to take the piss out of him. The Liberals benefited from the economic prosperity of the Roaring Twenties, as well as being a beacon of growth and stability since they had been in charge for nearly 30 fucking years at this point, but Duplessis was able to effectively outmaneuver Mercier through raw charisma. The Conservatives provincially were slashed in half seat-wise, but Duplessis succeeded in ripping Trois-Rivières from Mercier after 27 years of Liberal control by a margin of a mere 126 votes. Mercier was sent to the dustbin of history after this, and Duplessis gained his seat of power that would catapult him into provincial significance. When the Legislative Assembly convened at the beginning of 1928, the chicanery began in earnest. The Conservatives were pretty much an opposition that existed only on paper, but Duplessis did his job to the best of his ability. Because the odds of affecting provincial policy were pretty low, Duplessis adopted a mindset of putting his home constituency first above all. He spoke with elegance and respect, and even Premier Taschereau personally shook his hand after his first speech. The rest of 1928 and 1929 was fairly uneventful, save for Houde being elected mayor of Montreal, and then in July of 1929 being elected new leader of the Conservative Party. Basically everyone asked Duplessis to take the job, but he said, nah, not right now. Houde is a dumbass, he won't last long, then I can pounce. Now, Houde was nicknamed the Canadian Mussolini, and he was kind of a jackass, so he and Duplessis did not get along. He was the least politician. He was a fiery populist with a temper on a hair trigger and a grandiose style, and this meant the very traditional and well-organized Duplessis came to absolutely fucking despise him. But for now, he was in charge and needed to be respected, at least in a roundabout way. Duplessis continued doing his thing, going around and speaking and doing busy work until September 26th of 1929, when he got into a fucking car crash and almost died. He would survive, just with some head trauma and a long scar across his face and head. Of course, though, Duplessis wasn't the only one to experience a crash that fall, because almost exactly a month later, it took a second for the ripple effects to hit Canada, but when they did, they hit hard. Quebec didn't have it as bad as other places due to its more diversified economy, but the province was still racked by record-high unemployment and a mass exodus from the cities to rural areas. This had the knock-on effect of reversing the fortunes of the Liberals federally. William Lyon Mackenzie King's plan of just do nothing Lamau was backfiring spectacularly, and the 1930 election saw the Conservatives sweep to power, albeit very briefly. The Tories would also fail to do anything of substance and lose in 1935 to Mackenzie King again, but this gave some hope to Houde and the provincial Conservatives that maybe they could eke out a win. Hopes were further bolstered by the increasing corruption apparent in the Liberal Party, with Taschereau doing a whole lot of cronyism and Liberal MLAs making a shitload of money on the side. Trois-Rivières, with Duplessis' help, would also go blue in a federal by-election, which seemed an ill omen for the provincial Liberals. As the 1931 election drew nearer, Duplessis continued his campaigning as a level-headed guy who would fight for the farmers, advocating for similar farm loan programs that were happening in Ontario and, take a guess, Louisiana. Gotta pay attention to the big man downstairs, of course. However, the biggest threat the Tories had was Houde himself, who Taschereau was able to paint as a degenerate urbanite, an inconsistent loudmouth, and a rogue operative who could not provide the stability that the Liberals would be able to. Election comes around, Tories get fucked. again. Duplessis only kept his own seat by 41 votes, and Hood lost his own seat in the process. The Tories immediately started bitching about a stolen election and voter fraud, because the more things change, the more they stay the same, and Hood spent nearly $80,000 demanding recounts, but no dice. Hood and Duplessis fell out very quickly, and Hood secretly also backed a recount in Trois-Rivières that was issued by a random person who was secretly backed by the Liberals. Duplessis suppressed this challenge by ordering a couple of his thugs to literally kidnap the man and beat the shit out of him in a shed in the countryside until he dropped the case. Several months of absolute political chaos in both parties followed, which included the Liberals shoving through a bill which effectively banned challenging an election unless you were rich as fuck, which pissed everyone off. The only real winner was Duplessis, since he vocally opposed the recount attempt and made many friends amongst those who wanted Hood to fuck off. With Hood facing criticism from all directions and a generally apathetic voting public, he would lose the mayoral race in 1932, after which he resigned as leader of the Conservative Party. The Canadian Mussolini died as he lived, like a little bitch. He would be re-elected mayor in 1934, and he remained a thorn in Duplessis' side, but he wasn't really a major problem anymore. Duplessis not taking the leadership nomination had proven a great boon, because his only real rival Hood had just committed political suicide. He was promptly elected party leader at the next caucus meeting in October of 1933, and his ascension came at a perfect time too. The liberal policy of just do nothing Lamau that was preached by Taschereau continued to falter, as Quebec absolutely struggled to stay afloat amidst the Great Depression. As opposition leader, Duplessis absolutely excelled, able to exploit every opportunity the Liberals handed him. In 1934 and 1935, Duplessis toured the entire province, speaking to crowds of thousands. This coincided with the Liberal Party fucking exploding. They suffered a big defection by a group of leftist and nationalist members of caucus, heavily influenced by Catholic corporatism, which was a thing that emerged in Quebec around the same time, who split to form their own party, the Action Libérale Nationale. Duplessis and Taschereau both attacked them because they liked the status quo, and the platform of ALN threatened to take votes from both, but Duplessis sensed an opportunity. In November of 1934, he began making overtures to the party to see if some cooperation could be achieved, and they began working together unofficially. He was still very hesitant, though, because they were liberal defectors at the end of the day, but his hesitancy would evaporate after the federal Conservatives got unexpectedly mauled in the 1935 election. Taschereau saw an opportunity to capitalize and called a snap election a couple months later. Duplessis knew they would lose, but saw an opportunity to wrest some votes away from the Liberals, so for the 1935 Quebec election, the Conservatives and the ALN signed a coalition agreement, where the ALN platform would be advanced. This coalition was loose for now, but would eventually grow into something impossibly powerful. The coalition was lovingly dubbed the Union Nationale. The UN enjoyed massive popular backing amongst the nationalistic population, as well as amongst the rural farmers and industrial workers, with Duplessis adopting a borderline socialistic tone in some instances. Meanwhile, the clergy heavily backed the UN as well, and they began working their electoral magic whenever they could. Both parties used their machines to the best of their ability, and in many ridings it became a contest of who could use their own thugs to rig the election most effectively. In a machine versus machine contest, the only loser is the people. 1935 saw Taschereau cling to power, but his seat count was slashed almost in half. The ALN took 25 seats, while Duplessis and the Tories went up to 17, putting the UN within a bee's dick of dethroning the Liberal machine. Duplessis himself went from a 40-vote lead in his riding to a 1,200-vote one. He almost immediately moved against the leadership of his coalition partners, getting some people loyal to him in important positions, and he began pushing for a merger, because if they didn't, the coalition would explode. By mid-1936, most of the ALN MLAs were allies of his, and Duplessis was walking and talking like a unified leader. The Liberals, meanwhile, were in a tailspin. The opening of the legislature almost saw a fight break out, and the attacks across the floor were vitriolic, with Duplessis easily painting himself as a voice of calm and reason. Months of political bullshit occurs, Duplessis starts really pressing the government on its corruption, and then it comes out that Taschereau's brother Antoine was skimming off the top and depositing the interest earned with government funds in banks into his personal accounts illegally, with him defrauding the government of over $120,000 fucking in 1936 money. Game over. The UN organizes demonstrations and marches, and the entire province is up in arms. The government collapses, and Taschereau resigns as premier, being replaced by Adélard Godbout and triggering another election. The ALN attempted to assert itself away from Duplessis, but his own machine had infected the party and effectively puppeteered it, and he was able to force out their leader and essentially force the unification of the two parties into a singular Union Nationale in June. When the election occurred in August, Duplessis secured a decisive victory and the Liberals were absolutely decimated. 39 straight years of Liberal rule came to an end and Duplessis was sworn in as the newest premier of Quebec. He immediately moved to stack the civil service with loyalists like a good little machinist, purging several departments including the Liquor Commission and essentially cutting the head off the deeply corrupt provincial police and replacing it. People in useless positions were fired by the thousands and their jobs consolidated and vestiges of liberal corruption were aggressively rooted out. Once this was all done, he turned around and purged a few of his closest allies, and then he could turn to salvaging the absolute clusterfuck that was the state of the province. His first year saw the government spend an absolute fuckload of money. He instituted his farm credit policy, providing low-interest loans to farmers to keep them afloat during recovery, and he also instituted reformed old age pensions, as well as instituting pensions for those with injuries and for single mothers, implemented workplace safety laws, established a minimum wage, banned public figures from serving on corporate boards of directors, and started large public works projects like paving roads, rural electrification, opening new parks and gardens, and more. He also, ironically, expanded the size and scale of the government, establishing new ministries for health and natural resources to more efficiently manage them. He also did a big-ass corruption audit that went in waves over the course of 3 entire fucking years just to spice things up for everyone, in many instances beating confessions out of people and bullying witnesses into giving him the results he wanted. This did end up revealing that millions of dollars had been smuggled around over the last decade, so I suppose it worked out. He also got electrical rates in Quebec City reduced by going to the office of the company and convincing them to lower their rates for the good of the people. It's implied he threatened to absolutely fucking ruin some people's lives with a snap corruption audit. He also had himself installed as Attorney General, giving himself an insane amount of power over the legal system. Duplessis was even able to throw his now massive political machine into getting Hood defeated in Montreal and replaced with a UN loyalist, which further strengthened his power. None of this came easily, though. The UN was now very much the party of Duplessis. He had created a populist political machine in record fucking time, and as such, he took a sort of middle ground between the ALN and conservative stances. As such, a chunk of the party, both ALN and conservative, would revolt against him at various points. His refusal to outright nationalize hydroelectric was a considerable break from established conservative policy. The conservatives were the government intervention people, just roll with it, and as such, he had a couple of ministers resign and defect. Several ALN members would also defect over the course of 1937, with many taking to calling Duplessis treasonous. He responded by cracking down, stripping disloyal newspapers of contracts, and essentially rigging multiple by-elections against his former allies. On the social front, the province was swept by an anti-communist hysteria sparked by the Catholic Church, causing Duplessis to shove through the padlock law in 1937. In theory, it gave the government the power to arrest people for distributing communist materials, seize all of their stuff, and place their property on hold by literally padlocking it. However, the law was super vague because it didn't actually define what a communist was, and as such, anyone Duplessis didn't like was magically a communist. This included trade unionists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, dissident politicians and newspapers, entire corporations who had nothing to do with communism and just had their shit in someone's house, students groups, and all sorts of other people. It was an absolute assault on both free speech and property rights, and it was the first big public sign at Duplessis' willingness to resort to authoritarianism to get his way. But as I said, there was a whole lot of changeless change. One of Duplessis' promises was to abolish the sales tax, which was instead kept in place. Instead of overhauling and nationalizing the forestry industry, a few rules were tweaked and that was it. He also continued a lot of the prior Liberal government's corruption, pushing through a loophole that allowed companies to be exempt from taxes, and promptly having half of the province's big businesses get fat tax breaks, which was a large disconnection from his antitrust attitude. And of course, he ran what was essentially the biggest deficit in provincial history up to that point, and the government was up to its ass in debt it couldn't realistically pay off without breaking other promises. Lots of the money went to his beneficial programs, but much still went to things like bailing out the Sepulsion Order and funding some personal projects back in Trois-Rivières. Overall, his first term was a mixed bag. However, it being a mixed bag caused problems. Many in his own party saw him as a tyrant, while many in the public figured he wasn't doing enough to actually help them out. The Liberals did begin to pick up some steam, with their speaking tours being well attended, and Duplessis didn't help his case by purging the government and making more enemies. Like I said, the UN was the party of Duplessis, and anyone who didn't prostrate themselves before his supreme bigness was on thin ice. His political shenanigans were pissing people off in ever-increasing numbers, and the authoritarian tendencies of Duplessis began to draw ire. In a fit of absolute bullshittery, lottery, the Liberals backed Hood for mayor of Montreal in 1938, and he would win, marking his 4th non-consecutive term as mayor. This combined with Duplessis doing more authoritarian shit, like redrawing some electoral boundaries to effectively disenfranchise certain Liberal areas and leave one of his opponents in his own party out of a job, to create a storm in the province. Ultimately, Duplessis had gotten cocky. He was convinced that he couldn't lose, since he figured his political machine had its tendrils deep enough in society. However, people weren't blindly loyal. Here's some political advice of a Spartan. The illusion of being ineffective is a death sentence for any prospective machinist. People will let you get away with so much bullshit if you just look competent. Duplessis simply didn't do enough good to justify his excesses and his authoritarianism, and the rapidly spiraling debt crisis the province had gotten itself into under his watch didn't help matters. And he wasn't exactly in a position to partake in Florinomics, I'll tell you that much. When the election of October 1939 rolled around, one that he himself called early in an attempt to affirm his mandate, Duplessis got ass-fucked. His biggest bargaining chip was being against conscription, but the Liberals on both levels pulled a trump card and also declared that they opposed conscription. Then, Duplessis gave a speech drunk, where he declared that the UN would go out of their way to sabotage the war effort, which caused their English support base to evaporate and more of his allies to jump ship. Basically, everyone he had ever burned a bridge with had come back to bite him in the ass, and the results were crushing. The Liberals reversed the situation almost completely, reducing the UN to 14 seats. Hood was also back in office as an MLA. Adelard Godbout became the new premier, and pretty much Duplessis' entire cabinet was wiped out. Both Mackenzie King and the actual king were pretty stoked, since this meant that Canada would be united to fight the war without fear of Quebec doing something funny. And of course, Taschereau was cackling like a madman watching the results come in. Ultimately, Duplessis screwed up massively. He didn't play the political game properly, and it cost him everything. To most, it seemed that his career was over. The Union Nationale was a passing fad. Duplessis was a mad dog doomed by his own corruption, all the tactics of a dictator but without the skill to wield them. But the snake of Canada was not out of this fight yet. Not by a fucking long shot. The one benefit this blowout had was, ironically, purging all but those totally loyal to Duplessis and the UN idea. The Liberals immediately made some money moves. One of the first things they did in April of 1940 was pass women's suffrage into law, which Duplessis voted against because he's an asshole. Some bullshit about family hierarchy and social hygiene and women don't actually want to vote or something. They also finally got to audit the UN for once and found that Duplessis was spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year while in office, which was nearly double the province's income, which was a terrible look for Duplessis. A bunch of new taxes were implemented in an attempt to get the province solvent again and also bail out Montreal, yes, the entire city, because it had been fighting off bankruptcy for like 4 years now. The cocky and confident man had been reduced to a quiet and contemplative boy, and perhaps for the first time in his life, he did some introspection. In the meantime, France fucking dies, and now Quebec is much more pro-war than it was before. Mackenzie King pushes through the National Resources Mobilization Act, which enabled conscription but only for home defense purposes, which nearly cost Godbout his premiership right then and there, but he was able to distance himself from it. The conscription crisis back in 1917 had nearly caused a civil war in Canada. It would 100% nearly cause one again if it couldn't be spun as something other than what it was. Hood had turned on the Liberals and started calling conspiracy on everything from conscription to the economic troubles of Montreal. A story about this in the newspaper was edited by a person affiliated with the UN to come across more as a declaration, and Hood rolled with it and declared that he would do everything in his power to stop people from registering for conscription. Under the War Measures Act, this is sedition. Hood was promptly arrested and sent to the Petawawa camp with Adrien Arcand, where he spent the next 4 years in internment. Sometimes problems just solve themselves, you know? In the meantime, Duplessis managed to pull off a couple of by-election wins, which showed he was still kicking. The Liberals did a few other big things with their time in office, notably the introduction of mandatory schooling for children, and finally getting around to nationalizing utilities and creating Hydro-Quebec. But overall, it was a pretty chill time. Both sides showed reasonable solidarity when it came to the war effort, and both made points to attend the large masses and demonstrations that occurred in support. Just don't use the C word and everything will be fine. Well, Mackenzie King just couldn't let it go. He rocked up and just casually went, "I'm gonna say the C word," and then all hell broke loose. Conscription would once again be the issue that threatened to tear English and French Canada apart. Anti-conscription nationalist factions were already popping up, and a plebiscite on the matter that was held returned very divisive results, with English Canada overwhelmingly supporting conscription and French Canada overwhelmingly being against it. And these results didn't really look that great for the federal government. Duplessis amped up his yapping about federal overreach in this and other instances, and the pendulum looked like it was beginning to swing swing back. He catered heavily to the nationalist vote when he set out on speaking tours, holding no punches and comparing the Liberals at both levels to Hitler and other people who wanted to strip French Canada of its rights and assimilate them once and for all. This was followed by the formation of the Bloc Populaire, a nationalist party at both provincial and federal levels. The people that made up the bloc were former allies of Duplessis who fucking hated him, so no cooperation there, but they would hopefully fuck with the Liberals. The run-up to the 1944 election was just a chaotic mess. Duplessis resorted to extreme anti-Semitism, claiming that the government was taking Jewish money to settle 100,000 Jewish refugees in the province, while continuing to rail against any form of federal intervention. Of course, this was just made the fuck up, but people actually bought into it. Much of his kind demeanor was now replaced by that of a fiery, passionate, and angry man, and with French and English conflict heating up and the general hysteria at an all-time high, this strategy worked like a charm. Godbout was suddenly the root of all evil, a boogeyman who was trying to destroy the province. He would retort by calling Duplessis a crypto-fascist and a puppet of the trusts who sought to destroy Canada for his own gain. Duplessis responded by calling everyone else fascists instead. He preached nationalism and autonomy to the French and imperial unity and war support to the English. By the end, Duplessis lands on top. Barely. The first big issue of Duplessis' second reign was, of course, conscription. In November of 1944, the federal government broke its promises and ordered conscripts sent to Europe. These conscripts wouldn't actually do anything because the war was nearing its end, but it was the principle of it that mattered. Duplessis actually played it very smartly, encouraging calm in the province, all while the Quebec Liberal Party fucking exploded and mass demonstrations broke out. The crisis was nowhere near as bad as the First World War I was, and Duplessis condemned the move but kept the situation controlled. Now, gone was the fiery populist, replaced once again by that calm and collected politician. Hood was also released from prison, and despite both the Liberals and Duplessis backing another candidate, he swept into his 5th non-consecutive term as mayor of Montreal. This fucking guy. Maybe he needs a fucking video at some point, Jesus Christ. As the war came to its end, Duplessis went about ensuring stability above all else. He had actually learned from his mistakes, and the UN was to be far more moderate and less belligerent and overconfident than the one of his first term. The UN took the form of the ultimate center party, at least in theory. Duplessis carried his party to victory by pinning every subversive element on the Liberals and third parties while utilizing the vast wealth of the UN political machine to smother other opposition. Duplessis played the voice of stability and tradition while using his own larger-than-life personality to carry him the rest of the way. Now, since we have like 16 fucking years left to cover here, I won't go into insane depth and just focus on overarching themes. La Grande Noirceur had fallen. The term La Grande Noirceur was a creation of an event that occurred after Duplessis' death to describe the deeply conservative and often repressive atmosphere of his reign over Quebec. It is very one-note, and ignores a lot of social and political context to paint the period as an awful hell time before the revolutionary enlightenment of the 60s and 70s. It is an inherently pejorative term, and most modern historians agree that it isn't really a good way to describe the period, and historiography has moved away from referring to it by that name for the most part. You can't possibly distill an entire time period spanning multiple decades into a single catchphrase. That said, I think it sounds cool, and we have so few cool-sounding one-phrase descriptions of time periods these days, so fuck you, it gets a mention. Of course, the time period itself requires extensive description to give you an understanding of what led to the term being adopted in the first place. The term party state would be a fairly good way to describe the Union Nationale. The party influenced all levels of governance, and the party treasury was paid into by nearly every business in the province, used daily to dispense patronage to people from all walks of life, as well as give fat compensation to party elites. People received their patronage based on their loyalty and service to the party and the state, as well as Duplessis' personal opinion and their importance in maintaining the party state. Partisanship infected every level of the civil service, including the police, and contractors were expected to pay their dues to the all-seeing eye. The people of Quebec gradually settled into familiarity, unwilling to seriously challenge the system that, by all accounts, was at least working pretty well. Everyone from the lowest rural farmer to the highest government official got their proportional slice of the pie, and this bred complacency and stability. Quebec, under the man newly christened Le Chef, was essentially a paternalistic dictatorship. Duplessis was the guiding hand, the gentleman usher, the stern yet loving father at the helm of the nation. And this let most people forgive his authoritarian excesses and the lack of reform in the province, so long as things kept chugging along the way they were. The people knew that things like schools, hospitals, factories, roads and railways could be bought with votes for Le Chef, so vote for him they did. Newspapers and broadcasters who ran unfavorable stories were personally accosted by UN goons and threatened with destruction if they did not praise him. His ministers were a cadre of sycophantic yes-men who didn't really do any independent thinking for the good of the province. As long as the general prosperity continued, nobody really cared. And when bribery didn't work, massive electoral fraud generally did, ensuring Duplessis was essentially unchallengeable. La Grande Noirceur wasn't so much a literal dark age of chaos, strife, and reaction. Instead, it was more a veil over the population of the province that stifled their development and freedom of expression and action, enabling the UN to achieve unquestionable control over the province. And ultimately, despite the narratives of La Grande Noirceur, the Union Nationale was pretty popular for much of its time in office. This gave Duplessis free rein to do whatever the fuck he wanted. He spent such an obscene amount of money that it's not even remotely funny to think about. The 1956 election saw the UN spend nearly $10 million fucking dollars just on campaigning, not to mention dumping tens of millions more into public works projects to give the voters their slice of pie. This was, of course, kept up by literal constant auditing of every place money went and how it was spent by everyone even remotely associated with the party. This allowed him to say there was very little corruption, because this corruption was all on the books. He was a hell of a micromanager as well. He wanted zero changes to the system, and he wanted to know that every motherfucker on his payroll was doing their job to the letter and nothing more. And because the UN kept winning, there was no need to change, so the government got efficient and clean. If nothing else, the UN ran a tight ship and was one of the most efficient governments in provincial history. The cult of personality around Duplessis also grew to farcical proportions. He was a king and he fucking acted like it. Those who did their job were loyal to a fault and did not question orders were rewarded with government positions, fat bonus paychecks, and even government contracts, while those who were not were often publicly humiliated and forced to bend the knee. Duplessis was Quebec, and neither les autonomistes nor the Liberals had any hope of changing that for the moment. Even Hood was able to reconcile with Duplessis after some intervention from a fellow named Robert Rumilly. Oh, and Duplessis also adopted the flag of Quebec, which is cool. The flag of Quebec was a major milestone because it served as a key part of defending the sovereignty and culture of the province. The Union Jack wasn't very French, after all. This also ties into perhaps Duplessis' most significant contribution, furthering and defending Quebec's cultural and political autonomy. He fought with the feds constantly over absolutely everything, and as such, the province had a level of autonomy that wasn't really matched by anywhere else in Canada during his reign. Economically, the province under Duplessis was a mixed bag. He took a very hands-off approach to matters of the economy, but still utilized interventionism when it was needed. Quebec would modernize and industrialize at a pace somewhat slower than other provinces like Ontario, but it tended to be more thorough and effective modernization in the long run. Duplessis was a man obsessed with rural life, so he naturally placed many protections on that ideal, which somewhat hindered development. But the wheel of capitalism ground on regardless. His big interventionist policies focused on infrastructure. He constructed massive highways and road networks to keep the contractors busy and keep the patronage running, while simultaneously massively improving societal efficiency. He also pulled off a massive electrification campaign, and by 1960, 98% of farms were fully electrified and being supplied with modern equipment, compared to a mere 20% in 1940, allowing for significantly greater agricultural efficiency. And of course, he used government funds to build thousands of schools and medical facilities across the province just to hammer home the paternalistic idea. The main issue he had was that much of the capital involved in modernizing Quebec was either coming from outside of the province or coming from the English. A very large chunk of the province's industry was owned by a clique of English businessmen in Montreal, and another large portion was owned by American conglomerates, especially in the natural resource sector. For all he preached about French-Canadian nationalism and freedom from foreign economic tyranny, he really struggled to actually prevent this state of affairs. But otherwise, times were solid, downright prosperous even. Quebec was modernizing and was rapidly developing in a very strong manufacturing sector by the mid-1950s, and more wealth was being produced by the province than ever before. Poverty was low, unemployment was low, and people got their pieces of the pie. Asterisk, unless you were a worker or a member of a union. Yeah, I'm not gonna fucking gloss over how repressive Duplessis was. In this case, Duplessis fucking hated you. He believed that all unions were communist, and because he really hated communism, he really hated all non-Catholic unions. And even the Catholic unions, he still tried to crack down on repeatedly. He would pass a lot of token legislation designed to give just enough ground to the workers to reduce reduced the power of the unions, but nowhere near as much as the workers would have deserved. As such, strikes were ever present in the province. For all of Duplessis' talk about protecting the little man from the fat cats, he was very quick to jump to the defense of the bazillion-dollar corporations. If you so much as asked for a smoke break, he would not hesitate to put you down. The government would direct the police and its own private thugs to go violently break strikes whenever they cropped up, and these often came with dozens of high-profile arrests. These crackdowns inevitably led to more strikes, which perpetuated a never-ending cycle of repression and lack of respect for workers' rights. The province was also rather unkind to the Inuit population in the far north and the other indigenous populations in the center regions. Extensive resource exploitation of these regions was performed by the Duplessis government and the businesses it allied itself with little regard for the people that actually live there. It also partook, albeit mostly indirectly, in further assimilation attempts by allowing the foundation of multiple residential schools at the request of the federal government and the Catholic Church. Everyone hates federal intervention in the provinces until it involves fucking with the indigenous people. The Church sought to enforce French-Canadian identity onto these populations in an attempt to pacify them, doing so through forced practice of Catholicism and banning their native languages, along with a lot of physical and sexual abuse. This is very par for the course when it comes to Canadian history, but I think it's still important to bring up. If you've noticed, a lot of this negative side of Duplessis' reign stems from the Catholic Church and its role in society. It created its own set of problems, which revolved around a degree of societal suffocation of anything that the government and church deemed to be unbecoming of Quebecois society. This meant things like the arts and hard sciences struggled to flourish if they did not conform to the church and the government's view of how art and science should look. Furthermore, the sheer power of the church over society meant that anyone who broke this conformity was ostracized and denounced by the people who had a shitload of influence over the public consciousness, leading to many ruined lives and a very gradual brain drain as many artists left the province for greener pastures. On that note, I also want to touch on two more aspects of their control over society in more detail: the role of women in society and the role of the church in social services. The church and the conservative elites of society enforced a highly traditional view of women and their status in society. Because the church and government had near total power over society as it stood, this conservative and subjugating view was the law of the land for the most part. Women were still very much expected to dress and act a very certain way, and if they didn't, they risked social ostracization. It is a fascinating thing, then, that the publication of Le Refus Global in 1948 featured so many women. Two of the signatories were Therese Renaud and her sister Louise, and Therese's early life is a near-perfect encapsulation of Quebec society at the time. Therese was born in 1927 to parents who represented a veritable Canadian aristocracy. She was a very rebellious individual from a young age, something that was deeply frowned upon in girls of the time due to the societal expectations imposed upon them. She was unruly and curious, and yearned for a freedom she knew society would deny her, for which she was punished severely by her mother. After her mother died, she was placed in the care of a miserable nun at the suggestion of the local priest. This woman physically and mentally abused her and her sisters for over a year for having the audacity to strive to be her own person. The Catholic and conservative school system she was then sent through sought nothing more than to crush any individuality she had, forcing a spiritual guilt of being wired wrong in some way onto her. She was force-fed anti-Semitic, anti-communist, and anti-English films and writings, and continued to be physically abused. While she would survive these ordeals, the enforced socialization had its effect, and she would develop into a fairly quote, normal Catholic girl by the rigid standards of the church. But the church failed to break her curiosity, and she found herself enraptured by the comparatively lax standards at English schools, which were non-segregated, and drawn to all of the things that were deemed taboo and sinful by the church. By 14, she had stopped attending Mass and had dropped her Catholic indoctrination in favor of artistic expression, leaning into dance and writing as an outlet for her emotions. She cried out against the stifling of women in this society, the demands to conform and smother desires and wants in the name of pleasing those in positions of authority. For the majority of women in Quebec, Therese's story was reality, stifling and suppressing. Independence and nonconformity was punished brutally by a society and church that refused to see its way of doing things challenged. And this would continue under the reign of Duplessis, as the church was given free rein to continue these regressive policies. In many ways, the women who put their names to the manifesto were committing the ultimate treason in the eyes of broader society. That isn't to say women were totally docile, though. Quite the contrary. necessary. Feminist movements had a significant foothold in the province, and many women worked tirelessly to see this state of affairs changed. Women played an especially key role in the unions, and participated in many strikes when they cropped up. However, society remained against them, and it wouldn't be until after the fall of the UN that major advances would be made in the field of women's equality. And finally, the church had a massive role to play in the social service system. Duplessis was fiercely resistant to the idea of government social welfare, mostly because the federal government was paying for all of Quebec's welfare policies. He believed in the idea of charity and other bullshit like that, so the church was the deferral point for most social services. They ran most hospitals, nearly all education, including several universities, had a huge number of convents running, as well as other things like institutions, labor unions, etc. This had its benefits in preserving Quebecois identity, undoubtedly. Church schools went out of their way to educate in French and carry on aspects of French culture in times when the English overpowering them seemed increasingly common. General education was fairly high quality, and the medical services the church provided were generally pretty good. However, this also comes with its fair share of baggage. The example I will use to illustrate this is that of the Duplessis orphans. Essentially, throughout his reign, thousands of children would be abandoned by their parents and institutionalized in Catholic orphanages or other facilities. The official purpose was to have an environment to raise mentally ill children. In practice, mental illnesses were often misdiagnosed, and large numbers of children were perfectly healthy but were simply born out of wedlock, or were simply not wanted by their parents, something that was deeply frowned upon by the church. Many of these children would be mentally, physically, and sexually abused by church attendants, while those deemed to have mental health issues were forced onto medications or forced to undergo torturous therapies. Survivors, ironically, developed real mental illnesses because of their treatment. This was all the church's fault, with the approval of the Duplessis regime. The power of the church meant that their excesses proved extremely detrimental to large parts of society, and I think it's an important thing to acknowledge. All this together was life, with all its ins and outs and ups and downs in Quebec society under the reign of Duplessis. For many, it was surely a good time full of stability and prosperity, but for many others, it was nothing short of miserable. Thus is the dichotomy of history. So, Duplessis, this fucking guy. Personality-wise, like I said earlier, he was a natural politician. He was very intelligent, attractive, and dumped all of his stat points into charisma. His upper-middle-class upbringing practically enforced a gentlemanly demeanor, and he was very rarely seen wearing something other than a well-trimmed suit. He was a very charming man with a strong work ethic, and these traits essentially guaranteed his tenured reign of Quebec. Unlike most politicians, he put his money where his mouth was. He called himself a good listener and a friend of his constituents, so he spent literally hundreds of days a year visiting basically everyone in his city just to check up and see how they were doing. He answered every piece of mail he ever received, talked to constituents constantly, and even offered himself as a reference for job applications to anyone who asked, and even offered to pull strings to help them get accepted. His patronage system was so fucking dense that your first high school job could realistically have been granted to you by the premier himself if you had the balls to ask for it. This gave him an air of trustworthiness that few politicians could even hope to emulate. After all, it is much easier to trust a guy with your vote if he shows up to your house and asks how your kids are doing in school and brings a bag of dog food for your pet since he knows you've been on hard times lately and you are working multiple jobs to make ends meet, and he just wanted to let you know that he was there for you and trying to make your life better no matter how hollow the words may seem from a politician. Even for his disgraced enemies, he maintained a degree of magnanimity, allowing people like Taschereau and other liberals to retire in peace with full honors and pensions just to show how good of a guy he was. He had mastered the long-lost art of being a politician that actually acts like they are nice people who give a shit. As his life went on, he compared himself more and more to an aristocrat and carried himself as such in his dealings. He was a king, and like many other machinists, he fucking acted like it. In what free time he had, he enjoyed reading first and foremost, but was also an avid art collector and frequently attended the opera. Of course, he wasn't a particularly sparkling guy. Despite doing his best to appear as a pious and noble gentleman, this guy was a fucking sinner. For one, he was a functional alcoholic. He was a heavy drinker and was known to appear at many public events and even his own speeches heavily intoxicated. And he was a mean drunk too, getting belligerent and violent while under the influence. His alcoholism gave him numerous health issues and nearly cost him the leadership of the UN multiple times. He also never married, as established, but that didn't stop him from being a massive womanizer. He had dozens of very short flings with women during his time in office, and it's heavily implied that he essentially had groupies that made appearances at some of his meetings. These meetings weren't really meetings, of course. His His home while in legislature was a few rooms in the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, and he frequently hosted absolute ragers with his cronies disguised as political meetings. He also was not one for subtlety, tending to run his mouth at people he didn't like, which made him many enemies. And of course, he was corrupt to the fucking bone. He didn't take bribes, but he sure as fuck gave them, and he surrounded himself with a kleptocratic collection of men who were personally loyal to him and him alone. He was a king, and like many other machinists, he fucking acted like it. He promoted conservatism, traditional family units, and social hygiene, and practiced basically none of it himself. Par for the fucking course, I suppose. Now, this would improve dramatically in his second stint in office, and after 1950, he definitely calmed down a lot and focused a lot more on actually being the guy he tried to show himself as, but it's still important to bring up. His political and social beliefs are also a collection of wacky things. He was very much a conservative and very much a product of his time, environment, and upbringing. He essentially worshipped the country life ideal, like many Quebecois of the time, seeing rural life as calm and traditional and as the true human way of life. For a large chunk of his political career, especially during the Great Depression, he promoted a return to the land and slow industrialization as a method of economic reform. This obviously went nowhere, and he would eventually concede and invest more in the cities and industrialization to prevent Quebec from falling dramatically behind the rest of Canada. His religiosity and nationalism also made him a big colonial apologist, which is kinda funny. He was very much opposed to women's rights in most instances, voting against their right to vote several times, and fiercely criticizing feminist movements as unpatriotic and an attack on the traditional and Catholic values of the province. On a similar note, he supported the ideas of social hygiene, which is a nice way of saying he believed society's problems could be fixed through faith and discipline. Despite himself being basically a frat bro, he played the morality card and railed against what he and the church saw as the degeneration of society caused by socializing and urbanization. He blamed the cult of capital and rampant materialism for most societal ills, longing for a return to an idealized, pious, and morally pure society. Anyways, as per usual, Duplessis is a complicated character. His excesses and his authoritarianism meant that history would not be kind to him, especially as Quebecois society liberalized, and the Duplessis years were increasingly looked upon as a bad time overall. Regardless, as he was the Union Nationale, his personality and beliefs are necessary to understand to fully grasp the situation. Now, with all the pieces in place, we can enter the final act. The 1948 election saw the Liberals crushed fully and Duplessis' lead extend to an unshakable level, with Godbout shrinking to a mere 8 seats and Duplessis rising to 82. The constant attempts of the federal Liberals to control taxation and a lingering resentment over the conscription issue meant that the provincial Liberals got slaughtered. Duplessis also continued his anti-communist attacks, accusing the Liberals of abetting communist activities because the only communist federal MP in Canadian history happened to be from Quebec. Godbout lost his own riding and was out of provincial politics, being replaced by Georges-Émile Lapin. The defeat would be the worst performance of the Quebec Liberals in their history. Duplessis decided to then do the funniest thing in the history of comedy and simply run the same election campaign over and over and over, and the Liberals got absolutely cooked by it every fucking time. His favorite argument was, of course, accusing them of being communists because of the Cold War, and he could run on his track record of things being pretty okay economically. 1952 saw Duplessis win again, but with a reduced lead and vote share. A large part of his campaigning centered on autonomy from the federal government, which continued to be a strong vote pull for many. 1956 continued this dominance, with Duplessis focusing heavily on the achievements of the government and throwing the covers over all of their less savory bits. Like it or not, the UN was popular. Liberal attacks, however, were beginning to pick up some steam. As the UN's corruption gradually became more apparent, the Liberals called it out more and more frequently. But the opposition had the problem of being disunited. The Liberals tried to ally with Social Credit of all people in 1956, but this wouldn't change the outcome. The result was yet another Duplessis W, but no significant changes on either side. However, not all was perfect in paradise. The newspaper Le Devoir, spearheaded by up-and-coming journalist Pierre Laporte, exposed the UN at every opportunity. In 1954, Laporte ran an investigation of the government taking sizable kickbacks from construction companies in exchange for favorable contracts for the construction of a dam. Then, in 1958, the UN was rocked by the natural gas scandal. Essentially, the government sold off the natural gas division of Hydro-Quebec. Le Devoir came out and revealed that this sell-off off was performed with a lot of real sketchy insider trading, with several members of Duplessis' cabinet making millions on the sell-off and giving the shares to private companies for pennies on the dollar while the public footed the remainder of the bill. This scandal decimated public confidence in the government, and Duplessis had an absolute fucking breakdown when the story broke. He had several journalists roughed up and even filed a lawsuit against Le Devoir, but it went nowhere. What this scandal wasn't good for was Duplessis' health. He was suffering from diabetes and general exhaustion from his constant work, but he refused to take breaks and actually rest for once. The scandal only made his problems worse, as his mental health began to decline dramatically as well. If anything could topple his government, this was it. So he continued working. In September of 1959, he took a trip to Schefferville at the invitation of a mining conglomerate to tour the mines and other infrastructure. On September 3rd, while at a cottage he was staying in, he was having a conversation and smoking a cigar without a care in the world. Out of nowhere, he gets ill and feels a massive shot of pain through his head. Seconds later, he hits the ground. He had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, paralyzing the right side of his body and losing his ability to speak. Le Chef clung to life for 4 more days in horrible agony, suffering further hemorrhaging before finally achieving peace in the early hours of September 7th. Labor Day. He was 69 years old. He was laid in state multiple times, and his funeral procession to his hometown was attended by hundreds of thousands over the course of several days. He was buried in the Saint-Louis Cemetery in Trois-Rivières. This may all seem very abrupt, and that's because it kinda was. Your brain'll get ya, that's for damn sure. But now the big question on everyone's mind was simply, what now? The helmsman was dead. The UN was rudderless, and now it was facing an increasingly strong Liberal Party which could very easily capitalize on the party losing its popular leader, as well as the controversies that were now rapidly multiplying. As if things couldn't get any worse, Paul Sauvé, Duplessis' successor, would die less than 4 months later, and he was replaced by Antonio Barrette. Sauvé had made a push to modernize the party, doing away with much of the corruption and clientelism that had defined Duplessis' reign, but he was now fucking dead, and Barrette had some impossible shoes to fill. He did his best, but the Liberals had him beat. Their new leader was Jean Lesage, a young and popular man who ran on a crusade against corruption, aided by a very popular upstart named René Lévesque. Lesage pulled tricks from Duplessis by making himself known as a man of the people, and the crippled UN could not counter. The result was Liberal victory, and the end of the reign of the Union Nationale. The party would win one more election in 1966, but afterwards rapidly spiraled down into irrelevancy. It would be totally destroyed in the 1973 election and vacillated between zero power and a few states until 1989, when the party was formally disbanded. The election of Lesage would trigger a massive cultural shift in Quebec, a part of which was the complete destruction of Duplessis' character and legacy. The term La Grande Noirceur was even created just to declare his reign as a before time. As such, impartial biography of the guy basically doesn't exist. He also has a fairly limited presence in popular consciousness. He has multiple monuments, roads, geographic areas, and an electoral district named after him, but much of the artistic depiction surrounding his likeness is pretty negative. He was a man who would never, and likely will never, outrun his legacy of corruption and authoritarianism. However, it must still be said that he was very important to the history and development of Quebec, and erasing that legacy does a disservice to the nuances of history. Ultimately, despite their slander at the hands of Duplessis and his government, and broader society, the signatories of Le Refus Global would get the last laugh. Most had long since moved on. Many were now married with families, had significant success in their artistic fields, or were dead. But what they called for all the way back in 1948 now had a chance to bloom into something explosive. Revolutionary, even. The end of Duplessis and the reopening of discourse under the Liberals would trigger one of history's biggest cultural shifts. Religious traditionalism, social conservatism, and the influence of the church on society would be swept away on a tide of reform and secularization. It was to be a revolution of consciousness. But it would not be a violent revolution at the point of a gun or at the bottom of a guillotine. Instead, it would be a quiet revolution. Big shout out to the oligarchs and politicians who prop up my political machine over on Patreon, with an extra special shout out to Ukrainian Shadow Government, Charles Zhelak, Peter Bardos, Ministry of Autismus Affairs, Wolf Commissar, Jonathan Hernandez, Cheese122, A Normal Cow 5, Black Mare, Smothy Who, Andrew Deffenbaugh, Jay, Ray Nertz, Ouch That Hurt, Seor, Harper's Ferry Blues, Ziam Z, Greek Nationalist, The Flag and Anthem Guy, Price, The Oil Master, Gangdolf Bangdolf, Arabian Nights, Kim, Ask89, Codename Titan Zebra, L. Walter Doro, Protector of the Faith and General Secretary of the National Salvation Council, that certainly rolls off the tongue, iRatman, and Billiam Bones. If you would like to see yourself a part of the patronage machine under the benevolent dictatorship of myself, consider joining my Patreon. Tiers 2 and 3 gain access to the Spartan Journal, basically extra content every month. And on that note, I will wish you all a wonderful Canada Day and say that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.